This is Francella Kerr at her home on West Lawrence Avenue in Mooresville. Today is April the 12th, 2006. And Ms. Kerr, we thank you so much for allowing us to come and interview you and hear your stories about growing up in Mooresville and your life in Mooresville and the other connections that your family had with the development of Belks in Mooresville. So when you were a child, where did you live in Mooresville?
I first lived on Main Street in a house not directly across the street from where Bill Neal lived, next to the post office. But I think the next house, it was a big, two-story, drafty house, and Mother and Daddy had built a new house in Charlotte, and she hated the idea of leaving that new house and coming to Mooresville. But this was where Daddy wanted to be. And then you grew up? Then I moved from there to Academy Street, and then moved to, when I was 3, to West Center Avenue, and grew up beside the only person I ever had that represented a grandmother to me, which was Miss John Houston. And we rented the house that Ona Houston later lived in. And then when I was 13, Daddy built on North Main. We moved there. And that's where I grew up. And
what are some of your memories of living over on West Center?
They were the best years of my life. That was undoubtedly the best neighborhood a child could grow up in. I felt perfectly free and welcomed in any home. Now I'm talking about from the where the old hospital was, down to the end of the street. And I was in and out of those homes there, and I remember the old hospital and playing with the daughter of one of the cooks that cooked for the hospital, and had the free range of the pastures behind the house, and there was no reservoir back behind there. And of course it was primarily a neighborhood of boys, and I played on a boys' level. You know, if you wanted to play with them, you had to play what they played, and so I was pretty rough and tumble.
When you say from your house to the end of the street, you mean going west on West
Yes,
Center? Not towards town, but
no,
but west.
And Marjorie Cresswell lived there, and she and Mary McClellan were the two nearest my age that lived on that street. And one thing I did that might be interesting, I had a cat when I was 10. I got sick, and nobody could tell me what was wrong with the cat. I had taken the cat up to W. Johnston's grocery because Hal Johnston knew a lot about animals, and he couldn't tell me what was wrong with it. And I had asked everybody in Mooresville that I knew that had anything to do with animals, and nobody could tell me. The cat was getting worse. So one evening late, it was still daylight, I took a quarter out of my savings bank and took the cat and went up to what was at one time the old hospital, but Dr. McClellan was living there, and his family were living there in that hospital. Knocked on his door, interrupted his supper, and he came out and stood on the porch, and he very just like he would examine a human, he examined my cat for me. And he said, I think the cat has an abscess. And I tried to pay him my quarter, but he wouldn't take it. And I went back and told Mother that Dr. McClellan said my cat had an abscess in the throat. Well, she started feeling around the cat's throat and felt something sharp. And when she felt that, she pulled on it, and there came a needle with a thread that was down that throat's esophagus. And the minute that got out of that cat was back alive, big time. But it made the front page of the Mooresville Enterprise. And Dr. McClellan was so gracious when he was examining my cat. Made me feel like I hadn't interrupted, bothered his supper at all. And another experience I had with Mr. Price Sherrill, he traveled and home usually on the weekend, but he also raised pointers. And he had a litter of pointers. And we sort of congregated in the yard and played with those puppies. And everybody said we were going to ruin those puppies. And my favorite one was one he called Rex. But he let us play with those puppies. And that puppy was later sold to L.C. King and became a national champion. So we didn't ruin him. We just made him better. And then there was a tennis court that was built on the corner of Charlotte Street and West Center. And so we had that for recreation. We would gather there and we'd play tennis. We'd have a pickup game. And didn't much like to get to play with John McClellan because he didn't like to run back and forth across the court to return your ball. And but the Harts were on one side of me, and Cora and Meade Hart, and he had a car with a rumble seat, and that was a big deal to get to go to ride in his rumble seat. And then he had a nephew, Essie Hart, Carter's son, Numa, that used to come and visit, and I got real mad at him one time. I don't know what it was about, but he had on one of those aviator caps that with a buckle, metal buckle on, and I grabbed that cap off his head and hit him and split his head wide open with that buckle. And scared to death, but his mother didn't make a big deal of it, and my mother didn't, and so I've often wondered what it would be like to ask him if he remembered that experience, but I don't know whether he does or not. And then they moved, and the Bohannons rented that house for a while. And one of the things that I did that I paid for dearly was Homer Brantley was a great friend. And of course he was a telephone man and he worked on the lines. And when he would come and work on the line and the pole in front of our house, I would go to the pole that had steps on it, up there at where the alley started down by the hospital. And I would climb that pole and pretend I was working. I thought, well, one day I took a chain with me and got as high as I could get without being in the wires, actually, and put that chain around me. And, of course, leaned back like he did when he was working on the line. And my chain broke, and I hit the cement. And I was 10 when that happened. And it was Little Baron Mills, what we called him, was visiting. He and his mother were visiting because Daddy was out of town. He was in New York. And I told Little Baron to go tell Mother I'd broken my arm. Well, he went and told her, but she said because I could wiggle my fingers, I hadn't broken my arm. And it took me 2 days to convince her that my arm was broken. And she finally took me to Dr. Templeton, and he put it in a splint and bandaged it up, but did not x-ray it. And later that evening, he called and told Mother that we're not being fair to her. I want you to go to the hospital and have a fluoroscope. And that arm was just hanging, the big bone was just hanging by a thread. So they properly splinted it and all after that. But that was the cause of all my back problems that I paid for very dearly in later life. And
little do we know how one thing like that can affect the rest of our life.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, we know that your family, your father was instrumental, well, in the beginning of Belks in Mooresville. Tell us how he came to Mooresville with Belks.
He came in June the 1st, 1926. Now, Belks had actually been opened. A lot of people don't know that Belks was originally in the 100 block of Mooresville, not in the 200 block. And if you'll give me I'll give you some information on that. Because Roddy has the opening ad for Belks in his office, and this is the information he gave to me from that ad. Belks was actually opened March the 21st, 1924. They bought the stock from the old W.M. Freeze company. And if my memory serves me correctly, it was not the building next door to Miller Drug, but the next one. They bought that lease and the merchandise in and that's where they were first located. And they would open at 8:30 in the morning. Joe Gudger was the first manager. In this ad it says that Mrs. Rogers, who I believe is Harding Sr.'s mother, if my recollection is correct, she was a milliner. And Mrs. Houston, and that was Miss Belle Houston, who was Jimmy's grandmother, were to remain as employees of the Belk store. And their slogan was better service and value. We sell it for less, and anything could be returned. If it couldn't be, find something you wanted in place, you got your money back. And so that's where it was originated. And then in 1929, they bought the building on Main Street where the Civic Center is now located, and moved there. And during the years, they acquired the old Carpenter building. It was on one side, and the Wise floors. Originally, it was a furniture store, Whitley Wilkinson Furniture Store. then became Wise Florist. They both built that building on the other side. So there were actually 3 business buildings together. And they stayed there till 1921 and moved out where they are now at the Mooresville. The Festival Center, not real sure.
You mean 1991?
1991, yeah. And I think to see that building destroyed, it was one of the hardest things I had to watch. And it's only because Roddy wanted a beam, part of a beam, out of the original building, that I went to the destruction site, and the man was very gracious to cut me a large beam for him, and then some smaller parts of that beam. And then I picked up some of these original face brick that were on the original building before they did all of that that was part of the Mooresville plan. And I have built into this window back here one of the old lion's heads that were on the face of the original building. Mm-hmm. There were a number of round ones and there were rectangular ones. And Roddy has one of the round ones, and I had my round one put in, which will not go when this house is sold. It becomes Avery's.
Francella, you mentioned Roddy. Would you say for the tape, who is Roddy?
Roddy's actually my son.
Okay.
We called him Roddy because there were too many Roberts around.
Just like there were too many Francises. You told us about your name, Francella. Tell us that story.
Well, when I was born, Mother thought that there were already too many Francises in her family. She had been orphaned by the time she was 5 and was actually raised by an aunt. And there were just numerous Francises already in the family. And so she didn't want to name me Frances. My grandmother's name, her mother, was named Ella. So she put those two together and I became Francella. And it was the bane of my existence from then on. When I was in grammar school, I got chased around the playground. Born in France, lived in a cellar. But I can remember getting in a fight on the school ground. And went to South School. And that provided you with the best social education anyone could ever get. And I absolutely adored South School. And when the high school burned, then we had to accommodate some of the Parkview students. They would come and go in the afternoon. We went in the morning, they'd go in the afternoon. I don't know when where the high school went. But John Smith Templeton, who was a Parkview student, for some reason was there on the grounds, and we were playing dodgeball as a group of girls. And of course the ball went outside the circle, and he got our ball and wouldn't give it back to him. So I proceeded to fight him. My mother thought I'd never learned that I was a girl. My 4th birthday, she looked around and said I was having a fight with somebody. And anyway, I won and got my ball back. But when you had fights on school grounds, people congregated around and watched and egged you on. And then if you won, they followed you. And I couldn't get rid of this group. So I ran to Jack Rankin, who was the foreman of the WPA that was building Hood Field down there below the South School. And I knew he wouldn't let anybody bother me. He wouldn't tell on me. And so I really didn't get in trouble for it, because I don't know that Mother ever found out. But
Who were some of the teachers you remember at South School, Francella?
I had Tom McKnight's mother for my first grade teacher. I had Miss Belle McNeely for second grade, Sarah Hunter for third grade, Linda Templeton for fourth grade, Ruby Armstrong for fifth grade, and Cora Freeze for sixth grade. And one of the things Cora Freeze did with her sixth grade class was to take us on a train trip. We would go to Barbers Junction and then take the train to Statesville, and then we would have an outing in Statesville, and then we would catch the train and come back to Mooresville. And to me, the train was just a wonderful thing, because the store stayed open on Christmas Eve sometime till 10:30 at night. And Mother and I would catch the train and go to Charlotte about 4 o'clock on Christmas Eve to spend Christmas with her sister and her husband and 3 daughters. And then Daddy would come down after the store closed, and we would all have Christmas together there. And then even when I was at Queens Creek, there was no transportation because of gas shortage. And there was a train that ran from Charlotte to Mooresville that I could catch after my Saturday classes, that I would come home. And Cy Johnson was usually riding that train. And so that was just a good way of getting back and forth. I actually, my freshman year, went to Meredith, but getting back and forth to Raleigh was an experience during the wartime. You had to go around either to Statesville and then come to Mooresville, or to Charlotte and then come to Mooresville. You came by bus, came by train, you had to be met at Barbers Junction, and then to go back, I'd be taken to Salisbury and catch the train. I'd go in at midnight into Raleigh and catch a cab and go out to school. And one of the most interesting trips I had home was with Price Sherrill and his Model A. And there was me and George Stevens, Bill Campbell, Oscar Davis, and Price, and might have been one other, all in that Model A. And it took us quite a time to get home, and it took us a long time to get back, but at least we got there. And kind of got off of Belk.
Yeah, I was going to say, let's go back to Belks. We were talking about Roddy, and
Yeah.
so your father really was the one who began Belks here in Mooresville. Was that correct?
No, Joe Gudger actually was the first manager, but Belks had not been a successful investment. It was actually owned by Belk Brothers in Charlotte, and when Daddy wanted to become a manager, and I have his notes that he wrote down as to how he was going to present it to Mr. Henry, and so Belk's Mooresville was open, and that's where he decided that he would like to come. So,
When did it change from Belks to Belk, and why?
I really don't know. I always knew it grew up knowing it as Belk's Department Store. And if you remember those old bags, that shopping bags, there was a circle in the middle that said Belk's and under it Department Store. And then there were these triangular points that came out from around that circle. And each one of those points had a store's name on it. Now Roddy has a bag that had 7 points on it. And he also has one that has 16, and one that has 136, and one that has 166 points on it. But as they added stores, they added points around that circle and had the store's name and location written on that little point. And if I had to guess, it probably came Belk in the 90s sometime. Because they dropped the S and just became Belk.
Who were some of the other people who worked in the Belk's department store in North?
Well, Miss Belle Houston was over the dry goods department, the piece goods department, and back in those days, the salesmen came around with their sample books, and you had a little tiny swatch that you selected your material from. But when those were no longer current, the salesman would leave them with you, and that quilt is actually made by Mrs. J.H. Deaton for me from some of those samples in one of those quilt books. And Mr. J.H. Deaton was over the men's department. And Queen Brantley was in ladies. Frank Harris was there. He was in the shoe department. I'm trying to go back. A.L. McConnell was later, and Ross Brown were in the men's department. Hazel Hudson Sprinkle, who donated the land to the library, the additional 40 feet. I was her gopher, and she was in the hosiery and that department. And on Saturdays when I worked, she'd make the sale and I'd take it to the cashier's, what we call the pen, which was actually the cashier's desk, where change was made and the tickets were kept. And I would bring the change back for her, do whatever that she needed me to do. That's what my job was on Saturday. And I got paid, I think, 50 cents for the 8 hours. And then we had the first elevator.
I was just thinking about that lady who ran the elevator.
And actually, Odessa Sharp was the first one to run it. She had worked for, and she was a wonderfully dear person. She had worked for Mother, and had taken care of me. And so when they put in the elevator, Daddy said something to Mother about giving Odessa a chance to make more money, and so she became the first one that ever ran the elevator. I filled in spare time on Saturdays when I worked. And then Marie Bailey, I think is probably the last one that actually ran that elevator. Also, first store to have air conditioning, and so. But it was a family. I kept diaries, and if I go back and read my diaries, the store acted as a babysitter for me an awful lot, and because I felt totally at home with any of those, just loved being with that girl. Leila Robinson was the cashier. She was Leila Stewart, and we had a lot of young people that came home from college that would work during holidays, and in fact we depended a great deal on those that came in from college and to work during the busy seasons. And so at one time when they first moved to the Belk store, excuse me, where they're in the second block, they had a big stairway that came down on the first floor from the second floor, and on the second floor was where the ladies' wear was. And I remember they having a fashion show where they walked down those steps, and then then later when they closed that off, they had this. It's a system like the banks use when you go to an outside to make a deposit. One of those air things that would go up to the second floor, and you'd put your ticket in and send it down, and then make the change and send it back up. Then at one time they actually had a basket that you lowered and raised back up, and to have your package wrapped and to have your change and a ticket sent down. So
let me ask you something, Francella. You mentioned Frank Harris and working in the shoe department. I remember as a kid buying shoes at Belk's, where my parents took me up there to buy them. And they had some kind of machine after you tried your shoe on, you could stand up on it, and it's kind of like an x-ray or something. Comment on that machine.
Well, that was it's a machine to show you where your toes were in your shoes. But then it became unlawful to have that. It was considered a danger. But one thing I really want to remember, they had a scale always out in front of the store when I was very young, that you could, put a penny in or whatever and get your weight. But Mr. Henry Belk had a habit of visiting the stores on Saturday, and he wouldn't let you know he was coming. He would just show up, and he would walk out in front, up and down the sidewalk, and one of the first farmers he could catch to talk to, he would ask, well, what kind of store is this? And it just so happened that one time when he was doing that, he caught this Mr. Carrier. I can't remember his first name, but it seems that Mr. Correa had been a person that was hard to please. So when Daddy came to Mooresville, he told Mr. Deaton, said, now, I want Mr. Correa pleased no matter what it takes. And so the first time he came in, I think he bought a suit or something for his son and was not pleased with it. And so Daddy just told Mr. Deaton to give him his money back, give him a new suit or whatever he wanted, just to make him happy and to please him. Well, after that, Mr. Belk had this experience of running into Mr. Correa. Because Mr. Belk chewed tobacco and he wasn't above spitting in the elevator and he wasn't above spitting on the sidewalk. And I asked Mr. Correa what kind of store this was, and of course, having just had that experience, he gave it rave reviews. So, but Daddy always laughed about his just happening to run into Mr. Correa when he was up here to just find out what people in Mooresville thought about the Belk store. And
Well, now you've actually had, I guess, 3 generations involved with Belk. In with your father and then your husband.
and then Roddy
now your
is
son.
still. Roddy went with him in 1971, and is still with them. And I just think they're a wonderful family to have worked for and been associated with. And at one time, Henderson Belks said they don't count my time. I went to work when I was 14. Thank goodness Daddy brought me into his world when I was 14. And worked and then when I graduated from college, I immediately became the bookkeeper for the Mooresville store and the Union store. Daddy had opened the Union, South Carolina store in 1934. And then when I had Roddy in 49, I stopped working. But whenever any store was added, Daddy always said, can you come back and keep the books until I find someone to do it? So I've kept the books of Mooresville and Union and Salisbury and Statesville, Kings Mountain, Elkin, Sparta, West Jefferson. When they bought out Eford's, he said, well, anybody that had an Eford's where they had a Belk store, that Eford store was given to that person. So there were 2 places, 2 of Daddy's stores that had Eford stores. And so he asked me to come back and keep the books for those 2 Eford stores. And then the only store that he did not take when Hort Doughton died was the Conway, South Carolina store. And he said, I just don't want to have to travel that far to check on the store. So, but the books were in a bad shape. And before he was going to hand them over to anybody, he was going to get them straightened out. So I actually kept the Conway, South Carolina books. And actually through their building program where they built a new store there in Myrtle Beach. And then after they were all in order and we were through that building program, and then they came up from Charlotte and took those books. So I've had a varied experience with that.
He mentioned something about Hudson Belk, and I know that at one time stores were had hyphenated names. But there would be just some places would be a Belk store, and other places it might be Hudson Belk or something like that. Why was that?
When they opened a new store and brought in what they considered these partners, the partner had the option of adding their name to it, like Hudson Belk, Beck, and then the Raleigh store. I can't remember the name, but it was basically up to the partner to decide whether he wanted his name put on the store. And when Daddy opened the Union store, he did not. He said he didn't want to have it called Belk Cravens. So, and I have the incorporation papers for that store. I have up in the attic a lot of the old, I can't put my hands on it right now. I've been planning to clean out my attic for quite some time. All the old income tax reports and that sort of thing that they did, and one thing that I think was interesting, they gave the manager an awful lot of freedom. If they wanted to do any sort of remodeling or anything like that, it was usually the manager could work it out with a local contractor or builder to come in and do whatever was done. And Mr. A. Brawley did an awful lot of work with the Belk stores. Then with that local Belk store, and then when they actually had a real estate department and all of that, then you had to go through them and have the bids submitted and that sort of thing, and it was more or less taken out of the control of the manager as to who did any remodeling or anything like that. And but I know Daddy told me one of the first times he had a chance to buy some merchandise from a fire sale, he went down to talk to Mr. Belk about it. And Mr. Belk said, "Well, what do you think about it? You think it'd be a good deal or not?" And he said, well, yes, I think it'll be a good deal, but I just wanted to find out what you thought about it. He said, "Go on and make your own decision. It'll be a learning experience for you. If you made a good deal, great. If you didn't, then you will have learned something from it." And the only philosophy of his that did not go over too well, particularly with my mother, he asked Daddy to go to New York. This was before he came to Mooresville, to go to New York. And he told him, said, "Mr. Belk, I really can't go because my wife's expecting any time." And his answer was, "I've had 5, and you don't need to be around anyway." So Daddy found out I was born when he got a telegram on the train back home to Charlotte. And Mother had me all by herself, with the help of Orrin Moore and Presbyterian Hospital, all by herself. And so that did not go over too well with Mother, but that was the way he felt about it. And then I know that at one point they bought out the young men's shop, and I was totally free to go over and make the offer and close the deal himself. We didn't have to ask Mr. Henry what he should do and what he shouldn't do.
Francella, you mentioned that you started working when you were 14.
Mhm.
There weren't any child labor laws then because I think I started working when I was 12 or 13. Now, do you remember other children?
I had to get a permit.
Oh, did
I
you?
had to have a permit.
Oh, I don't think I
Yeah,
did.
I had to have a permit.
But do you remember other businesses in Mooresville where the young people, the children of the owners, worked?
Well, I know Louise Troutman worked at Doubt's Five and Dime on Saturdays, the same time I was working at Doubt's on Saturdays. I think it was just natural for the children of owners to be in the stores and to learn what was done and if you needed to run for them, okay.
There was a time of great freedom, as you've mentioned, because I can remember young people going uptown and walking the streets, and it was just...
Mother used to complain that she would dress me. She never could, this was when we were living on West Center, she never could decide whether to bathe and dress herself and then get me ready, because I would splash and whatever and get her where she didn't feel right. So she felt like she was very creative. She made these little aprons, like things that she just covered my whole. So she would get me ready and put one of these over me and tell me to sit on the steps and not move while she got ready. And then we would walk uptown. And she said, I never got you uptown that I didn't turn around and see you sitting on the curb and taking your shoes and socks off. Because I love to go barefooted. D.E. Turner Hardware was an interesting place for me because they kept my skates in running order for me. If I had any problem with my skates, all I had to do was go in there, and if it needed a new wheel, that was whatever my skates needed, they kept them running. And I enjoyed that place. It was an interesting place to be. In fact, Mr. D.E. Turner he took me out to eat when he was in the legislature and I was at Meredith. He contacted me and asked me if I'd go out to eat with him. And I thought that was a very nice thing for him to do. And then Goodman Drug they permitted me to leave my bicycle behind their store. I could ride it from West Center, to school, drop it off there behind Goodman Drug. We went home for lunch. I'd walk to Goodman Drug, get my bicycle, ride home, have lunch, ride back, and then after school was out, I'd ride home. And then I have good memories about H. and Johnson's and just feeling perfectly. When I stop and think about it, I'm really amazed at how much at ease I felt in places like these stores I have mentioned. They were so kind to a child. And
Tell about the candy that your mother
Well,
made you return.
I spent my dime allowance on penny candy at H. and Johnson's. And when I got home, Mother was very upset with me because I had wasted my allowance and had wasted it on candy. So she sent me back with that bag of candy. And I mean, it was a big bag of candy. Licorice whips and all sorts of things in there. And fortunately, the person that was there that I dealt with was Dick Johnston, who was a neighbor on West Center. And he was so gracious and kind to me and understanding, and took my candy back and gave me my dime back. So that was.
There were kinder, gentler times. In many ways.
And then we used to the name of Elmer Turner's, Mr. D.E. Turner's brother.
Mr.
Marvin Turner lived beside him. He had this gorgeous garden back behind his house and tulips in front. And I mean, I just felt free to ride my bicycle back there among his garden and walk and do anything that. And the only thing, when I moved to Main Street, he told me, he said, well, all the devil will have left West Center when you moved to Main Street. But it was kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing with him because I felt very accepted by him. And then I thoroughly enjoyed John Rankin. I took piano from Ms. Rankin, which was a mistake in that I have no talent. But Mother insisted that I take piano. But I just loved John Rankin. And you hear about what children pick up and all from at early age. I have no memory of his drinking. I have no memory of his cursing until I was a teenager. And actually, he would tell me, I used to hate to hear you coming with your skates. I'd hang on to anything that was nearby because I was just sure that you were going to run into me with your skates and knock my feet out from under me. But I was not aware of any of his alcohol problem when I was growing up. And I felt safe with him. He just was a very interesting person, I thought. And later he told me, because we had what we call those monkey bars across the front of the porch where Wisteria grew up. Well, they were good climbing bars too, and I would climb those bars and hang by my knees. And he said, I'd pass your house and being so drunk, and I didn't know whether I was upside down or whether you were upside down. And but I say I didn't know any of that until he told me later when I was a teenager.
Okay, any more questions?
Let me get you to comment on something, Francella.
Okay.
Lake Norman was actually formed in 1965 when Duke Power built Cowan's Ford Dam. I know that your folks, the Cravens, moved to the lake, built a nice house and moved to the lake sometime in that time frame. Now that was before even living at the lake was they were pioneers moving out there. What did you think about that?
Well, I'll tell you how that happened. Daddy bought 2 lots out there in 1962, and he gave them to me. And at one time, he had the opportunity to buy that whole peninsula there that Bubba Sloop developed for $40,000. And for some reason, he said, I just couldn't see it at that time. I just really couldn't see it. And And he later said, if I had, I would have replatted the whole thing and shaped some of those lots differently. Daddy was a frustrated architect. He just loved to draw house plans and those kind of things. And but I never thought that the muddy Catawba River would ever become the beautiful Lake Norman that it has become. And he decided he was going to build in 1965. And at that time we were still living on Main Street. And the opportunity came for us to buy this house. And Daddy said, well, why? Mother wasn't on that set. She didn't like the idea of having to keep up two houses. So they said, well, why don't we just turn the house out at the lake into a house that we can live in permanently, and then you buy on Lawrence and we'll go to the lake. So we both left Main Street about the same time. And I thought it was great. By that time I was having problems with my back, so I couldn't actually enjoy water skiing and any of that kind of thing, but my children certainly did. But my memories of the Catawba River went back to my uncle in Charlotte having a cabin on the Catawba River. And when you go down into the water, your toes squished in all that mud. And so I had no idea that Lake Norman would become what it would become. So, of course, I had to give Daddy the lots back since he was going to build on them. And he really enjoyed that lake experience. He could have his martins that would come. He just enjoyed sitting out watching them as a society of birds work. And when Roddy and when he came back into town because of his health, and Roddy and Sandra moved out, the one thing he asked Roddy was to please keep the gourds cleaned out and get new ones when they needed them, so the martins would still come. And that was that became difficult for Roddy because the person who supplied Daddy with gourds was on the board of directors and lived in Lincolnton, I think it was, Carolina First National Bank. And so it became a little bit difficult as those gourds wore out for Roddy to get them replaced. So he finally, before they moved to Charlotte, the martins went by the wayside. But that was quite a big thing when that was developed.
You have any more questions? Anything else you want to tell us about?
Oh yes, I love the ice wagon that came and delivered our ice, and they would shave ice for us and give us a handful of shaved ice, and then just walk through the house and just put the ice in the refrigerator that happened to be on the back porch, and that was just a big treat to get.
That was from W.N. Johnston.
Yes, the old ice house, and it just really bothers me that that's been torn down.
It bothers me a whole lot.
And excuse me.
I was going to say that we have heard that story from so many people that lived in that era about the ice.
And then behind there was a blacksmith shop. that's no longer. But I used to go to the blacks. I visited all these places when I was growing up. But there was a blacksmith shop behind there. I can't remember who it belonged to, but
I mean, in back of the ice plant, where the ice plant was.
it was off. You went in between that alley, between the ice house and the auto garage, and back in there was a blacksmith shop. And
Well,
and then
the ice wagons were pulled by horses. I mean,
Yeah.
so there were a big need for
and
blacksmiths.
so, well, it could have been owned by.
That I don't know.
I just don't remember. I just know I enjoyed going there, and then we had our milk delivered to the door, and we got it from the Harrises that ran a dairy, and
Well, we certainly do appreciate your telling us all these stories about Mooresville, and particularly about Belk's. That Belk's was an institution in Mooresville, downtown Mooresville, for many, many years. And
well,
all of us who grew up there have fond memories of shopping at Belk's department store.
well, thank you. I appreciate that, and I thought Belk was a good corporate citizen of Mooresville, and back then, and very much interested in the community. I can't say that I think that now particularly.
Okay, well, thank you so much.